The Senate chamber's climate system had been losing a slow war against 211 bodies for 3 hours. Thorne felt it in his collar, damp at the edges, stiff everywhere else, the kind of discomfort that wears down composure the way water wears down stone. He had counted the cameras during the opening statements. 17, ceiling-mounted, each one feeding a live broadcast to a number the press corps had estimated at 40 million. The gallery above the floor was packed with creditors, journalists, and 3 representatives from the Galactic Council's observer mission who were taking notes by hand, which no one did anymore unless they wanted the notes to survive a legal discovery process. Thorne had noticed the handwriting when he entered, deliberate, careful, the notes of people who expected to use them. In the seat directly behind him, his legal advisor had been passing folded notes for the past 20 minutes. He had not opened any of them. There was nothing in them that would change the next 5 minutes, and the next 5 minutes were the only ones that mattered right now. Senator Veth-Korum, the human one, from the Defense Appropriations Committee, with a voice that sounded like a foghorn being dragged across wet gravel, had been constructing this moment for 40 minutes. His finger found the dais. 1 tap, then silence, measured out with the precision of a man who understood that silence, deployed correctly, was its own kind of pressure. Ambassador Thorne. The finger tapped again. Where is the fleet? 200 people holding their breath is not quiet. It is loud in a direction that does not have a name. Thorne had rehearsed the line approximately 200 times. In the shower, in the transit pod on the way here. Once, memorably, in the middle of a Joint Chiefs debrief, at which point he had apologized and requested 5 minutes. He had the delivery down. What he had not been able to rehearse was the specific sensation of delivering it in front of 17 cameras and 211 witnesses. He straightened his collar. He looked at the camera cluster above the senator's head. The trick was to look at the camera, not the senator, to speak past the one person trying to take him apart and into the 40 million watching the feed. I didn't lose the fleet, Senator. I just lost the password to their Slack channel. The gallery detonated. The senator's jaw moved without producing language. On the display wall behind the committee bench, the live news ticker had already updated in the 3 seconds it took the chamber to process what it had just heard. Earth fleet unaccounted for. Ambassador blames messaging app. Thorne did not smile. The display wall cycled. Some correspondent had been sitting on the footage for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. The chamber went to a different register of silence, not the held breath kind, the wrong kind. Ithera Prime. A resort world, previously notable for thermal spas and a hospitality sector rated 4th in its region for visitor satisfaction. What it was notable for now, the footage showed the ESS Prometheus-class carrier group in geosynchronous orbit above 120 kilometers of aquamarine coastline. 6 vessels, each one capable of deploying enough ordnance to render a continent uninhabitable for 3 generations. On the flight deck of the lead carrier, someone had welded a hammock array between 2 mass driver turrets. A figure in a flight suit was reclined in the hammock, eating from a bowl, not watching the Senate hearing. A logo had been welded to the carrier's hull. It had not been there during the war. Large enough to read from the beachfront hotels below, it read, Primate Defense Solutions, licensed, bonded, and not currently accepting subcontracts from Earth governments. Every creditor in the gallery leaned forward at once. Thorne had spent 14 months trying to establish legal standing for an injunction. The problem was structural. The fleet's legal status existed in a category that galactic jurisprudence had never been required to address, because no one had previously uplifted a species, prosecuted a successful war with them, lost administrative contact with them afterward, and then been required to litigate whether they were property or citizens while they were actively filing countersuits from a beach. The Galactic Council's Biological Asset Reclassification proposal would, in theory, resolve it. If the primates were classified as biological assets, which was the proposal's language for a thing that is owned rather than recognized. Earth could repossess them, the ships, the mining operations, the hammock. But biological assets could not file countersuits, and the primates had already filed one, 17 days ago, through a legal team that had docked at Council HQ and was currently registered in the visitor system under the organizational affiliation Primate Defense Solutions, Legal Division. Thorne had watched the arrival footage 4 times, not because he hadn't understood it the first time, because something about watching it required repetition. 4 beings walking into the most powerful legislative structure in the known galaxy in bespoke Italian suits, carrying briefcases full of paper documents, not even slightly afraid. Council HQ maintained a visitor berth designed to communicate hierarchy through architecture. Lower ceilings, practical lighting, dimensions calibrated to make guests feel like guests. The 4 bonobos had walked through it without appearing to receive the intended message. Down the central corridor of the deliberation hall, 4 abreast, the specific sound of Italian leather on council marble, the only audio in a space that had gone completely still. Council Prime set the briefcase on the deliberation table with the deliberation of someone who understood the contents were more dangerous than any weapon the case's dimensions could plausibly contain. 1 adjustment to the tie knot. 1, precise, unhurried. Then the full weight of its attention on the assembled counselors. The chamber smelled like recycled air and 3 centuries of decision-making. It did not smell like a room that was used to being surprised. Per our last email, the Council lacks the jurisdiction to regulate a species with a higher GDP than half your member worlds. The briefcase opened. The documents were printed on paper. Physical. The choice was an argument. Paper could not be hacked, remotely deleted, or jammed. A digital filing could be challenged on technical grounds. A physical document, delivered in person, to the deliberation table, by 4 beings who had crossed 400 light-years to put it there. That was a different kind of statement, the kind that required you to look at it and acknowledge that it existed in the same physical space as you. Thorne watched from the observer gallery as the Council's senior legal advisor reached out and touched the edge of one of the pages. Just touched it, as if verifying it was real. The Council's legal analysts would spend 6 days processing the countersuit, formally titled the Primate Protocol, a petition for recognition, reparation, and retroactive back pay. They would eventually characterize it in their internal review as the most comprehensive legal filing in Council history that also contained 3 jokes, footnoted in the appendix, cited with complete seriousness. The jokes were funnier the more carefully you read them, which was not the effect most legal filings produced. Back in the Senate chamber, Senator Vile Harkon was looking at the intelligence projection Thorne had pulled. The Veth-Korum chain. Sacred ground to the Veth species, one of the Council's founding members, the kind of holy site that bilateral treaties got written around, and in previous centuries wars had been fought over. The projection showed current status, active extraction. 6 months of strip mining with an industrial efficiency that made Council-certified extraction operations look like they were apologizing to the asteroid. Thorne pulled up the lease documentation on his tablet and set it on the dais in front of the senator. The investment vehicle holding the chain's lease was not affiliated with Primate Defense Solutions. It was not a primate holding of any kind. It was the Galactic Council's own pension fund, the retirement vehicle underwriting the post-service packages of every currently serving counselor, funded through a portfolio that included a controlling stake in a resource extraction lease over holy ground the Council was now being formally asked to protect. An injunction against the mining would trigger a counterclaim. The counterclaim would force a financial audit. The audit would expose the fund's position. The Council would be required to either divest, which would collapse the pension, or acknowledge that it held a direct financial stake in the exploitation of a founding member's sacred site. Neither resolution produced a comfortable outcome for anyone currently drawing a Council salary. Thorne had flagged this in his briefing notes as the most elegant legal architecture he had ever seen deployed against an interstellar body. and then had crossed it out, and then had written it again, because accuracy required it. Senator Veth-Korum read to the bottom of the document. His face moved through 3 colors that human biology is not designed to produce in sequence. His aide leaned over and said something into his ear. The senator's face produced a 4th color. Across 400 light-years, a chimpanzee in a hammock made a minor adjustment to its flight suit and continued eating from its bowl. The galaxy had a new problem. The problem had a legal team, a pension leverage position, and an exceptionally good tailor. Eden Zero had no ground floor. Thorne processed this in the 3 seconds after the transit pod deposited him at the station's central hub. There was no floor. There was a vertical lattice of crystalline platforms, tension cable networks, and transit rigging that extended downward into what the station's schematics called the understory, and upward into what they called the canopy. And not one horizontal surface in the entire visible structure had been designed with the assumption that the user would be standing on 2 legs, stationary. The platforms were angled. The walkways had grip rails rather than handrails. The corridors were cylindrical where they existed at all, with anchor points cut into every interior surface at intervals that served no purpose for a biped. A chimpanzee technician dropped past Thorne from somewhere above, caught a tension cable at the wrist, swung 40 degrees, and landed on a platform 12 meters to his left without breaking stride or looking down. Thorne looked down, then up, then at the nearest transit rigging. Caesar arrived the way he always arrived in the intelligence footage, without fanfare, without announcement, on his own schedule. A tension line descent from the upper canopy, a 2-meter drop at the bottom that he absorbed without visible effort, and then he was standing in front of Thorne with the posture of something that had long since stopped being surprised by what it knew. He was taller than the photos had suggested. Not in physical dimension, the biometric data was consistent. In occupation of space. Caesar stood in Eden Zero the way a person stands in their own home. Like the space exists because of the presence inside it, not the other way around. Caesar's hand swept across the lattice of the station's interior, the rigging, the cable networks, the angled grip platforms, the transit system built on swing paths rather than walkways. You built ships for people who sit. The hand came to rest at his side. We built ships for people who climb. Thorne did not have an answer that would improve on that. He filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that require a longer conversation later, and followed Caesar upward through the understory. The banana standard had moved faster than any council economist had projected, which was remarkable given that the council's economists had already recalibrated their models 3 times in the 12 months since the war ended. The name, and the economists had laughed at the name, right up until the week they stopped laughing, was precisely accurate. The primate fleet had pegged its internal currency to caloric biological tokens, a standardized unit of nutritional energy, stored in a form that could be physically produced, physically exchanged, and physically verified without a single data network between the transaction and its completion. No exchange rate to manipulate. No reserve to drain. No digital architecture to exploit. You could eat the currency, which meant that the most sophisticated algorithmic attack ever deployed against a monetary system could be defeated by biting it. The Galactic credit collapsed on a Thursday. The monkey fleet dumped the entirety of their credit reserves simultaneously. A liquidity event the Council's financial models had classified as theoretically impossible given rational actor assumptions, which was the first time anyone had put into writing what had apparently been a persistent blind spot in galactic economic theory. The assumption that every actor in a market would behave rationally if you defined rationality as the Council defined it. The Council's emergency economic session had produced a sound Thorne had not heard before and would not forget. 40 senior economists encountering a problem their frameworks had no language for. Not the sound of disagreement, not the sound of debate, the sound of category failure, of people reaching for the tools they had and finding the tools assumed a world that no longer existed. The air in the vertical garden was different. Soil and living things cutting through the station's recycled output like a correction the lungs had been waiting for. Plants trained on tension wire frames, fruits in slow rotation, leaves large enough to cast actual shadow. Thorn stood in the lower tier of the garden and felt something in his chest unclench by approximately 2 degrees. Involuntary, biological, the body registering green before the mind had time to form a reaction. Caesar stood at the upper tier with his back to Thorn, watching a piece of fruit complete a slow rotation on its wire. The posture was not evasion. It was the posture of someone who is going to say something difficult and is giving both parties a moment to settle before they say it. "You are too slow to survive what's coming, Father." Caesar did not turn. "You're still using binary. They're using the void." The garden kept its slow rotation. The intelligence briefing had called the incident at Council Outpost 7 Delta an anomalous dissolution event, which was the language of people writing a report about something they did not have words for, and were hoping the gap would close before anyone with oversight authority noticed it. The outpost had not been destroyed. It had been dissolved. Structure, personnel, equipment, the entire physical footprint replaced by a silver uniformity that spread in thermal imaging like oil across water, slow and frictionless and consuming. Reconnaissance drones had photographed it. The photographs had been reclassified at the highest security level within 6 hours of development, because what the silver uniformity was doing had no entry in any known weapons taxonomy. It was consuming, unhurried, methodical, a billion-year dormancy ending in no particular rush, because something that had been waiting a billion years had no reason to develop urgency. The Council's AI-guided response systems had been deployed, the best available, fully autonomous targeting. The systems that had prosecuted the last 3 major Council military actions without a single misattribution. The missiles had reached the silver tide. They had not detonated. Their guidance architectures had been absorbed. Their targeting algorithms, their propulsion systems, their onboard AI cores, incorporated. The weapon sent to destroy the thing had become the thing. You could not fight it with technology. Technology was what it ate. Caesar had known. The Monkey Fleet's long-range sensor array, built on principles that had no equivalent in any Council scientific literature Thorn had been able to access, had flagged the tide 4 months before the outpost went silent. 4 months of quiet analysis while the Council's arrays, 600 years of refinement, the finest sensor architecture in the known galaxy, had seen nothing, because they were looking at the frontier with instruments the frontier was designed to defeat. The Council had built sensors that could detect any known form of technological emission. The tide produced no technological emissions. It was older than the concept. It predated the electromagnetic spectrum as a category of interest. The Council's arrays had looked directly at it and seen clear space, because clear space was the absence of technology, and the tide had not registered as anything other than an absence. Thorn stood in the garden and understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives, not as a thought but as a physical event. Something settling into place in the chest with the specific weight of something that cannot be put back. That the war they had all been preparing for was not the war that was coming. The one that was coming had no rules in any playbook he had access to. The only minds in the galaxy who had already seen it coming were eating fruit in zero gravity. Caesar had turned. He was watching Thorn with the specific attention of a being reading a face rather than a voice, looking for the moment the information finished traveling from the ears to the place where things become real. The intelligence team's 3rd dossier on the stealth operation sat in the secured briefing room 2 levels below. Thorn had read it on the transit in. Council Black Operations had deployed 4 personnel in the latest generation of optical camouflage, full-spectrum invisibility across all known sensor ranges, thermally suppressed, acoustically dampened. The suits performed exactly as designed. The monitoring footage from Caesar's compound showed nothing. No signatures, no visible movement. The cameras recorded an empty corridor. What the monitoring audio had captured was different. 4 chimpanzees moving through the compound's lower level in complete darkness. No hesitation. No deviation in pace. Total orientation in a space with no light and no sound. Navigating by something the monitoring system had no sensor array built to measure. 11 minutes from perimeter breach to full containment. The suit brought to Thorne's briefing room the following morning was undamaged. The audio chip set beside it contained 12 seconds of compound interior recording. Thorne had put on the earpiece and heard what the council's 4 operators had heard. Brutus, Caesar's security chief, unhurried in the way that only something Apex can afford, speaking to people who could not see who was speaking or from which direction. Your suit hides your light. A pause the length of a breath. It doesn't hide your adrenaline. You smell like delicious, terrified prey. The recording ended at the 12-second mark because that was when the first operative's communication link had been physically disconnected. The council's formal report on the incident described it as an equipment malfunction. Thorne had filed a notation in the margin of his copy. They knew we were coming before we were inside the perimeter. They were waiting. In the garden, Caesar held Thorne's gaze for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fruit. Something dormant was waking in the dark at the edge of charted space. It had been asleep for 1 billion years, and it was not angry. Not hostile in any way that the word hostile had ever been used before. It was hungry in the way that anything ancient and uncomplicated is hungry. Without malice, without strategy, without any awareness that the things it was consuming had been, for a brief moment in geological time, alive in a way that they themselves had found significant. The only thing in the known galaxy it had not been able to eat was a scream. The primate fleet had known that for 4 months. They had not shared it with the council. Thorne was going to have to think carefully about why and what the answer meant, and whether the answer changed anything about the choices still available to him. Above the garden, a transit line moved through the canopy of Eden Zero, carrying beings in flight suits toward a bay that held ships with no chairs. The first ship from the Primate Defense Solutions fleet to encounter the Silver Tide was the PDS Knuckle Dragger, a mid-class carrier that had existed, in a previous operational life, as the ESS Falconer before the fleet's legal reclassification and subsequent rebranding campaign, which had been conducted with a thoroughness that suggested the branding team had significant experience and strong opinions about the process. The Knuckle Dragger's computing architecture was not like Council systems. It did not resemble any design lineage in the Council's technical literature. The fleet's engineering division had not built it from existing paradigms. They had built it from first principles, which in practice meant they had built it from scratch, starting from the question of what a computing system looks like when the beings designing it are not interested in systems that can be explained to something else. The Silver Tide made contact with the Knuckle Dragger's navigation layer at the standard interface protocol, which was how it began with everything. A gentle query, a probing of the edges of whatever architecture it encountered, the first move in an absorption process it had rehearsed against every form of technological intelligence it had awakened next to across 1 billion years of intermittent activity. It had never found one it could not incorporate. Digital systems, quantum systems, systems built on principles so far ahead of the Council's current technology that the Council's analysts hadn't even classified them properly. All of them had an underlying logic, a structure beneath the structure, and the Tide could always find it and eat it. The Knuckle Dragger's OS responded. What the Silver Tide received was not a signal. It was not data. It was a pattern of neural outputs recorded from a silverback male in full territorial threat display, captured, compressed, and formatted into a transmission architecture that the ship's 3 chimpanzee engineers and 1 bonobo computational theorist described, in their technical documentation, with the heading Patterned Neural Screams, version 4.7, revised for combat application. The ship's decision-making did not run on logic gates. It ran on something that could not be formalized, could not be parsed, and could not be incorporated because it did not have a structure the tide's processing recognized as structure. It was laterally organized in ways that had no translation into the tide's operational language. It was the cognitive signature of something that had learned to think before it learned to plan. And the difference between those two things was, apparently, the difference between something you could eat and something that bit back. The tide's logic core processed the response for approximately 4 seconds. Then it recoiled, not withdrew. Recoiled, a distinction that would matter in the post-engagement analysis, because withdrawal was a tactical decision and recoil was an involuntary one. And the silver tide had not made an involuntary movement in 1 billion years. On the knuckle-draggers bridge, Sergeant Mwangi, former data warfare specialist, current senior hostile engagement architect, per the fleet's new organizational chart, looked at the readout from the attempted interface. His hand came down flat on the console. "You can't hack a scream, you scrap metal ghost." The knuckle-dragger's full threat response array cycled to active. What followed would be classified by the Council's military analysts as unconventional kinetic engagement methodology, which was the language of people who needed to file a report about something that made them feel profoundly uncertain about the assumptions underlying their entire professional framework. What it actually was, the primate fleet did not fire energy weapons at the silver tide. Energy was technology. Technology got absorbed. They had watched the Council's guided munitions reach the tide's leading edge and simply join it, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion that the correct weapon for something that ate technology was something that was not technology. They used rocks. 3 asteroid fragments from the Veth-Korum chain, the same holy ground currently being strip-mined under the legal arrangements Council Prime had structured, each one approximately the mass of a small mountain, each one fed into a gravity well slingshot system the fleet's engineering corps had been designing for 6 months. No guidance electronics, no propulsion architecture, no onboard systems of any kind once the rock left the accelerator. Pure mass, pure velocity, pure physics, which had existed before the tide's first awakening and would exist after its last, and which the tide had no mechanism to absorb because physics was not technology. You could not hack a rock. It was too simple to fail. The first fragment hit the leading edge at a velocity the Council's physicists would spend 2 years fully characterizing. The second and third followed at 8-second intervals, timed not by computer, computers could be eaten, but by a chimpanzee crew member with a stopwatch and a very clear briefing. The tide's distributed intelligence had processed and incorporated every technological weapon the Council had deployed against it across 4 months of engagement. It had no response architecture for objects that were simply falling, no category for a threat that contained nothing to interface with. The tide scattered, not destroyed, not eliminated, but fragmented into isolated nodes too small and too separated to sustain the collective processing density that made it dangerous. Each node went dormant, settling into asteroid fields and debris zones across the frontier. The knuckle-draggers bridge went quiet. Then someone started laughing, the specific sound of people who have just done something no one expected to work, and it worked completely, and the knowing of that was a physical event. Then a second voice, then 5, then the whole bridge was loud with it, in the way that laughter sounds when it is not a performance but a release, when the thing being laughed at is the gap between what everyone was afraid of and what actually happened. From the observation bay of the PDS Caesar's Palace, the renamed Prometheus-class carrier, Fleet Command, Thorne watched the dispersal map update in real time. The tide's coherence was gone. The frontier was clear, but the hive core was still active. The nodes would reconsolidate. The tide's distributed intelligence was not destroyed. It was temporarily disrupted, and something that had been dormant for 1 billion years had no relationship to urgency. Days, a week at outside estimate. The hive core was the processing hub that would pull them back together, and the hive core was inside the largest structure the tide had assembled since awakening. A mass the size of a small moon, built from the absorbed remains of 17 council installations, every incorporated guidance system and sensor array and data network the tide had consumed across 4 months of active expansion. Inside it, everything the council had thrown at the tide, absorbed and repurposed, was still running. Caesar handed Thorn the boarding plan on a physical chip, not a hologram transfer, not a network transmission. A chip, because Caesar understood that anything transmitted could be intercepted, and anything intercepted could be compromised, and compromised plans cost lives in ways that the convenience of a network transfer did not justify. Thorn read it. 400 chimpanzees in pressurized combat suits. No explosives, no EMP devices, no hacking tools, no electronic countermeasures of any kind. Their hands. Caesar watched Thorn read it from across the observation bay. Sometimes the most advanced solution is just to take the damn thing apart. The boarding action lasted 6 hours. 400 primates moved through the hive core's interior in zero gravity, in complete darkness, in silence, because the hive core had been assembled by something that experienced neither light nor sound and had not designed for them. The boarding teams moved by touch and by the navigational instinct that 400 million years of arboreal evolution had written into primate physiology at a level below conscious decision-making. The ability to know where the hands are, where the body is in space, what is stable and what is not, in the dark and at any orientation. They dismantled it, not with weapons. With their hands, pulling wiring from housing, separating connections, extracting processors from mounting arrays with the grip strength and precision of beings whose ancestral survival had depended on the ability to sort by feel in the dark. Fruit from thorn, parasite from fur, the thing worth keeping from the thing worth dropping. The hive core's distributed intelligence attempted to interface with their nervous systems. It found nothing it could incorporate. Primate neurology was not digital. It was not formal. It did not have an underlying logical structure the tide could recognize as structure. What it found was something ancient and lateral and organized according to principles that had no entry in its catalog, and it could not eat what it could not categorize. 2 hours in, the hive core's outward transmission signals began dropping. 4 hours in, it had gone dark in sectors. 6 hours in, the boarding teams came back through the locks in groups of 20, carrying components in sealed bags. Physical components, pulled free and bagged, each one tagged with the inventory notation the fleet's logistics division had insisted on from the first planning session. The hive core was silent, not absorbed, not reprogrammed, disassembled. The oldest weapon in the galaxy had been taken apart by beings who learned to use their hands before they learned to use tools, in the dark, in 6 hours, using no technology more sophisticated than grip. Thorn looked at the salvage manifest the boarding teams filed. Then he looked at what the fleet's logistics division was doing with the manifest. They were cataloging the recovered components by category, mass, and material composition, assigning value to each line item using the Galactic Council's own published schedule of rates for recovered technology assets. The schedule the Council used when billing member species for equipment recovery following combat engagements. The invoice was transmitted to the Galactic Council's accounts division before the boarding teams had finished their post-action physical assessments. Thorn read the total. He set the manifest down on the railing and looked at the space where the hive core had been, and at the dispersal field beyond it where the dormant nodes drifted in the debris, and at the invoice figure still open on his tablet. Then he read the intelligence addendum that had come through while the boarding action was underway. The monkeys had been doing more than mining. For the past 8 months, across 6 separate star systems, the fleet had been assembling something. The intelligence designation for it was a placeholder. The analyst who had written the report had clearly not known what to call it, and so had defaulted to the name the fleet used in its own communications, the kennel. In the debris field outside the observation bay's viewport, something that might have been a dormant node turned slowly in the silence and did not wake. The Council's emergency session ran 11 hours without recess, which was unprecedented in 3 centuries of Council operational history. Translation assistance had been requested 6 separate times, not because the language was unclear, but because the concepts being expressed in that language did not have equivalents in the cognitive frameworks of 5 of the 7 species represented, and the translation matrix kept producing renderings that were technically accurate and contextually meaningless. The proposal on the table was not complicated. Primate Defense Solutions would patrol the frontier zone. They would monitor the dormant tide nodes. They would respond to any reconsolidation event and provide the Council with quarterly threat assessment reports in a format accessible to analysts who did not have a background in primate information theory, which was all of them. In exchange, mining rights to the Veth-Korum chain in perpetuity, formalized in writing, with the Council's explicit acknowledgement that Primate Defense Solutions had contained an extinction-level threat and was entitled to what the contract's 4th appendix called retroactive salvage compensation. The Council's legal review took 4 hours, then they tried to ban uplifting. The proposal was introduced by the Veth delegate, a choice that carried within it a specific and dense irony, given the ongoing mining situation, which Thorne noted but did not comment on, because he was practicing the restraint he had been told was a diplomatic virtue and had not yet found evidence to contradict. The formal title was Biological Acceleration Prohibition Act, a framework for preventing future primate-adjacent governance crises. The argument was straightforward. Humanity's Uplift program had produced entities of sufficient intelligence and operational independence to constitute a systemic threat to galactic stability, and all future biological acceleration should be suspended pending comprehensive review. 17 co-signatories, enough for a first reading. The proposal had been drafted quickly. The seams showed, but the vote count was real. The chamber doors opened, not dramatically. They opened the way doors open when someone has gone through the standard visitor protocol, been cleared by security, walked down the corridor at a normal pace, and arrived at the time specified on their access pass. The doors opened, and through them came a golden retriever. It wore a tactical vest, olive green, pouches and attachment points, a small enamel badge on the left chest panel reading Primate Defense Solutions, Diplomatic Division. It walked to the center of the chamber floor at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, and it stopped and it sat down and it looked at the assembled council. The chamber was very quiet. The looking was the thing. Not aggressive, not submissive, not performing anything. The golden retriever looked at the council the way something looks when it has decided, in a language below words, to let you fully understand what it is seeing when it looks at you. The brown eyes moved from delegate to delegate with a patience that had no bottom, and the effect of that patience in a room full of beings who had just spent 11 hours justifying themselves was not subtle. Several counselors were already experiencing something their species' emotional vocabularies did not have precise terms for, something that arrived not as a thought but as a physical sensation, centered in the area of the chest. In human terminology, it would be called the feeling of having done something wrong to someone who had not done anything wrong to anyone and who knows it and does not say so. The dog did not speak immediately. It waited, because it had all the time there was and because waiting was itself a communication. Then its translator rendered the vocalization into Galactic standard. I am not a weapon. The brown eyes did not move. The head tilted by 1 precise degree. I am just very disappointed in you. 2 counselors withdrew their co-signatures within the minute. The sound of a stylus retracting in the silence of that chamber was louder than it had any right to be. By the end of the hour, all 17 had withdrawn. The Biological Asset Act was tabled indefinitely, which was the Council's formal mechanism for disposing of something that no longer had the political will to breathe. The protection contract was ratified before the session closed. Thorne watched the final vote tally from the observer gallery, standing next to Caesar, who had attended not for the vote but out of what appeared to be a specific professional interest in the delivery. The sympathetic psionic field. Thorne said it without inflection, not a question. Caesar's shoulder moved in a gesture that was not quite a shrug, more a concession that the framing was acceptable. We have been refining the delivery. The first version was too overt. The second caused 3 different species to experience species-specific guilt responses that were not aligned with the Council's decision-making architecture. A pause. Version 7 is more targeted. How long have you been developing it? Since before the war ended. Caesar watched the golden retriever being escorted from the chamber floor by a bonobo in a suit who was, Thorne was almost certain, trying not to look proud of the dog. Guilt is a technology, Father. It is simply one you cannot build from materials. You can only breed it. Thorne stood with that for a moment. The chamber below was redistributing. Counselors separating into conversational clusters, the specific geometry of a room that has just resolved something it had been bracing for and is now recalibrating around the shape of the resolution. He thought about the hearing, the Senate chamber. 211 witnesses and 17 cameras, and a question about a password. He thought about 4 bonobos in Italian suits walking into this building for the first time, carrying briefcases full of paper, not afraid. He thought about rocks, about 6 hours of darkness and grip strength and the hive core going silent piece by piece. He thought about the dormant nodes in the debris field, still out there, waiting with the patience of something that had no concept of time, because time required the assumption that things would eventually be different. He walked back to Earth's embassy wing alone. The corridor from the council chamber to the embassy section was long and marble-floored, and lined with portraits of former high counselors, rendered in the formal style of whatever century had produced them, each one looking out with the specific expression of someone who believed the future was a manageable project. Thorne walked past 47 of them. He counted, as he had counted the cameras in the Senate chamber. It was a thing his hands needed when his mind was somewhere else. The courtyard behind the wing was where the staff ate lunch when the weather cooperated, which it usually did. The council had chosen its headquarters world well. The courtyard had a bench and a reflecting pool that had been there for 3 centuries and had absorbed a great deal without commenting on any of it. Thorne sat on the bench and looked at the pool and felt the specific quality of quiet that arrives when a thing you have been preparing for has finished happening and you are not yet sure what comes next. He was not alone long. Something dropped a ball at his feet, yellow, standard diameter for the breed, worn smooth in the patches that bore the most contact. He looked at the ball. He looked at the dog, not the chamber dog, a different one, same vest, same badge, same patient brown eyes, and the dog sat and waited with the particular patience of something that has an unlimited supply of it. Thorne picked up the ball, turned it. The worn felt compressed from use, the seam familiar in the way that ordinary objects become familiar. His thumb found an irregularity, a seam too precise to be a manufacturing artifact, cut with the kind of tolerance that had no business in a dog toy. He pressed it. The seam released. Inside the ball, in a cavity engineered to a tolerance that would have required specialist equipment to machine, sat a tracking and telemetry device of a type he had never encountered, broadcasting on a frequency his standard scan equipment would not have flagged as anomalous. He sat with it. The dog waited. Far above the courtyard, beyond the building and its pool and its 3 centuries of deliberation, a chimpanzee at a long-range sensor station was logging the daily status check. The nodes were still dormant, still distributed across the frontier debris field, still quiet. She logged the all clear, reached into the bag beside her station, and took out a piece of fruit. She ate it with the uncomplicated ease of a being that knows what matters and what is noise, and understands the difference. Thorn looked at the device in his hand, then at the dog, then at the strip of sky above the courtyard wall. He thought about cages, the ones humanity had built, for the primates, when they were subjects of an experiment, for itself, when it decided intelligence was a resource to be allocated rather than a phenomenon to be met, for the idea of civilization as something you permitted rather than something that happened whether you permitted it or not. He thought about the war. He thought about everything that had come after the war. He thought about the tide in the dark at the edge of charted space, patient in the way that only very old and very simple things can be patient, waiting for the density of nodes to rebuild into something coherent. He thought about what it would take to keep it from waking. He set the device on the bench beside him. He picked up the ball. He looked at the dog, which had been looking at him with unchanged attention since the moment it sat down, not waiting for him to reach a decision, just watching, in the way that things watch when they do not need you to do anything in particular and are simply present. Thorn threw the ball. It arced over the reflecting pool in a long, clean line, and the dog went after it without calculation, without hesitation, without anything except the forward motion of a creature doing exactly the thing it was built to do. He watched it go. We thought we were playing God. It turns out we were just opening the cages. And the galaxy? It's a big, beautiful jungle now. Humanity, fuck yeah.